This is quite a simple story of an investor or investors who have aligned their values with the work that they've done and the impact that it can have. And I hope it's an inspiration to you all about what can be achieved by integrating, I think, the values that you hold in your day-to-day life with the way that you operate in other spheres of life. Now, these three trusts have had a long-standing commitment towards sustainable development and climate change. 25 years, in fact. Climate change is not a new issue. And that has required, I think, to be undaunted and unstinted in the face of climate change scepticism and disbelief of the incontrovertible science. And we are not here to demonise corporations by any means, but I do think it's fair to acknowledge the role that fossil fuel companies have played in prolonging that uncertainty, the deliberate attempts to confuse the public over the science of climate change. Now, for many years, the trustees, so Sarah, Mark and Julian, I think were frustrated that their endowments were invested in companies which were driving some of the challenges that they were trying to solve through their philanthropy, through their grant making. But in fact, they were advised, and it's still often the case that charities are advised in this way, that in fact there is in effect a brick wall between the endowment that generates the income to make grants and the grant making that you do. To them, that seemed, I think, that was a really uncomfortable position, that in fact they were invested in companies which were, I think, undermining the good that they wanted to achieve, and in fact their own values about how the world should be. But in fact, 7 years ago, Sarah Butler-Sloss and the other trustees of the Ashton Trust made a decision that they would no longer be invested in fossil fuels, the companies which are behind some of the problems driving climate change. So advised their fund managers that they would be divested from those. So that was that. As those portfolios are actively managed portfolios, it wasn't such a problem to remove those investments. I think at the time, it's fair to say that the decision was viewed as something that was quite naive and probably something that would have a negative impact on the income generated by the trust. But I'll come back to that shortly. About 5 years ago, the three trusts, the trustees, decided that they would actually be more positive in the way that they used their endowments and decided to allocate a proportion of their endowments towards impact investing. I'm not quite sure how many of you in the room are familiar with the term impact investing, but it's a sort of initiative that Séamus was talking about in terms of investments that would have a good financial return, but also deliver social and environmental benefits. And they employed a new advisor to help them do that, and it has been very successful. It's been very hard work for the advisor to find those good investments that deliver all of those benefits, but it's been possible. And in fact, some other trusts within the Sainsbury Family Charitable Trust have been part of that practice too. Now, I want to go back 2 years ago to the end of 2014. At that stage, amongst people, communities, organisations which were becoming increasingly concerned about climate change, there was a real sense of desperation, of crisis. We knew that the next important climate summit was coming the following year in 2015, but there was no sense at that stage that there would be a meaningful agreement coming out of that process. At that time, we still do, all of those trusts support an organisation called Share Action, a really brilliant NGO that works with investors to get the shareholders to campaign, to lobby, to use their power as investors to change companies. We were part of a process which actually was trying to encourage the big fossil fuel companies, the big listed ones, Shell and BP, to change their practices and in fact to acknowledge the climate risks that the companies were facing. In fact, the Ashton Trust, Sarah Butler-Sloss's trust, purchased 1 share each in Shell and BP so that she could be part of that campaign. But even at that time, I think the trusts were not convinced that those companies had any intention of changing their business plans. At the same time, we still support an organisation called the Carbon Tracker Initiative. It has done a quite brilliant piece of analysis that shows that if you were to burn all of the fossil fuels, the reserves which are on the balance books of the fossil fuel companies, we would far exceed what we know is the safe limit of climate change of 2 degrees. It would take us to 6 degrees or below, intolerable climate change. So if, in fact, we limit climate change to 2 degrees, it means that those reserves can't be used. They become valueless. They're stranded assets. And on the back of that, there's a movement that was beginning to grow in the States, the divestment movement and the divest invest movement. So this notion that actually those assets, the fossil fuel assets, are a liability, both financially and, of course, to humanity. If we burn them all, we're in a calamitous state. We can't afford to burn them, in which case they become stranded. Now, the trustees of those trusts, Sarah, Mark and Julian, and the other trustees, have always worked very privately and very self-effacing in their work, but on this particular issue, because of the crisis facing us all regarding climate change and this sense of urgency, uncharacteristically, they decided they would put themselves in the spotlight and take a much more prominent position to advocate for divest, invest in Europe and beyond. So to encourage both themselves to remove their investments and remove investments in fossil fuels, but to invest in the solutions, to invest in renewable energy, in microfinance, in sustainable forestry, in sustainable agriculture, etc. This movement has grown, I think, far beyond expectations, and it has largely been because of investors such as Sarah, Mark and Julian and other investors around the world who've taken similar positions, who have, I think, stood up with courage. And since that time, the value of the assets under management which have been pledged to divest or divest invest has grown from 50 billion to 3.4 trillion. That was last December, 3.4 trillion. The next announcement will be this December, and it has continued to grow exponentially. Now, the point of this is not to financially bankrupt this sector or this industry. You know, we still, all of us in our daily lives here, use fossil fuels. But what it is to do is to raise, it's a call to say, actually, we need very quickly to move from the fossil fuel economy we have to a fossil fuel free, a net zero carbon economy. And we need to be moving our capital there very quickly. And we need to align, I think, what we know is true inside of us in terms of this crisis with climate change and make sure our investments are moving in that way. So what have we learned in these quite hectic and tumultuous 2 years of this programme? Well, first of all, we have learned that actually good financial returns needn't be an oxymoron. We have found that actually, if you remove fossil fuels from your investments, you don't lose out financially. That's been proven by the Trust's own experience with their endowments, but also that's academic research backs that up. But also, if you invest with high environmental and high social standards, again, the returns are better. The companies who operate to those standards actually are better companies. They do better. We've also learned that one of the biggest barriers for investors who want to invest in a way that aligns with their values is the availability of products in the marketplace. It's easier for investors who have actively managed portfolios, but if you're invested in larger funds, that's much more difficult. One of my challenges today, not a challenge, I was asked to make sure that I can say something positive about the business sector, and it's very easy to say something positive about the business sector. Our experience is that there are champions in nearly every business, people who stand up for these sorts of issues, and we have found that certainly within the finance sector. Within every fund management, every financial consultancy, all of the index firms, whether it's FTSE or MSCI, there are people there who've been working for many years to develop these products and working to make sure that the risks, that more sustainable development products are there and available. So in the space of a year ago, I could have named a handful of these products. We had a meeting last week with fund managers, and there's a whole plethora of new products which are on the marketplace. But I think the most important learning point is that investors, and I think especially faith investors, have huge influence, probably far more than you might realise. So while divest, invest, and divest effective mechanisms about political mandate, the call for action, actually much more, they're a signal to the marketplace about changing demand from investors, about where people want to put their money, and the marketplace is responding to that. This morning I was speaking at an event, also a church event, Southwark Cathedral, and the brilliant John de Bevan, who many of you may know from CCLA, made the point that today's ethics are tomorrow's norms. And I think that's what we all need to bear in mind in how we use our money and the power that money from investors can have. I think some of the, it can be overwhelming, I think, the challenge of climate change and the new systems and structures we need to put in place to do something about it. But actually the risk is very urgent. And I said this morning, I'm not a financier and I'm not a theologian, and I sometimes feel a bit of a fraud standing in front of audiences like this who are probably much better informed on both of those fronts than I am. But I do very much love what Sir Francis of Assisi says, and I draw inspiration from this, and I hope that you will too, that start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and suddenly you find you are doing the impossible.